Well, sometimes people talk about these new seminarians as like the JP2 generation. I don't know if you agree with that assessment or not. But one thing I've noticed doing this work is even though I've been heavily influenced by John Paul II, I went to Rome World Youth Day. That's where I had my conversion. I love that man. I read his writings. I continue to from time to time. But I'm finding there's a lot of like new converts that they don't know who that is. They don't know who John Paul II is. Yeah. And I know you've done a lot of research into this, correct?
Yeah.
How much research did you put into this before writing your book? And then tell us a bit about John Paul II.
Well, in all my travels, I've been traveling speaking on chastity for 26 years now. A lot of times I just end up in car conversations with a priest or a bishop, and sometimes at a conference talking to a cardinal. And, I've always had the great love for John Paul. I got to see him 24 times in my life. And so whenever I'd meet these people, I would just ask them, did you ever get to meet the Holy Father? What was that like? And they'd say, let me tell you. And they would just share these just remarkable stories with me. And over the years, I just kind of stored all those up in my heart. And then when they announced what his canonization date would be, I'm like, okay, I need to share these with the church. And so I called back all the bishops and priests. And I said, hey, remember 10 years ago, you told me that one story about this healing or miracle. Could you say that again? And can I get you on record and put it in the book? And they'd say, sure. And I'd call the bishop, ask for 5 minutes, and they would talk for 2 hours about him. And
did you record these conversations?
Oh, yeah, everything. I asked the permission, audio recorded it, so I get the quotes perfectly. And then they'd say, you got to call Cardinal so-and-so. Oh, you got to call Archbishop so-and-so. I'll tell him you're calling. And then just one interview led to the next of these unbelievable stories of the Holy Father that were not released to the public until after he passed away. And so I collected all those stories, and then I read every book in the English language on John Paul. I wish I had access to the Polish, but I can't even imagine.
How many books?
Dozens and dozens and dozens. I mean, it was just tens of thousands of pages. And I said, okay, this is when he's getting canonized, so I got to get the book done by the printer by this day. It's got to get to the copy editor by this day. And so I did the math, and I'm like, okay, I've got to read about 250 pages a day for the next however many months, and then I'll get through all these sources and can crank out the book. And then when I had finished writing it, I gave it to George Weigel, the Holy Father's biographer, and I said, hey, can you read this for me? I'll pay you to read it, and just tell me what's wrong. Just take a red line, and if there's any urban legends, if there's any stuff that's creeped its way into this manuscript that isn't spot on, let's get it out. And so he went through and said, yes, this happened, but it happened that way. This one did not happen. This one I've never even heard before. And he came up with a list of ones he didn't even know about. So he said, you know what we're going to do? He said, I'm going to take this to Monsignor JPII, the Pope's personal secretary, and I will fact check all of this with him. And so I got back from Monsignor JPII. He said, yes, this happened. No, that didn't happen. Yes, it happened this way. And then he said, one, I cannot say. I'm like, what? I'm like, what do you mean you cannot say? Which means I can't put it in the book, because a yes means leave it in the book. A no means strike it out. I cannot say means I can't put it in, but he's not denying that it happened. And it drove me nuts. And so I'm like, dude,
I cannot say didn't mean I can't say because I don't know. You're saying he cannot. I
cannot say if it's true or false.
I see.
He's kind of keeping it close to the vest. And I'm like, okay, I got to figure out. And so I published the book without the story in it. But then went back to the drawing board. I got to find some sources here. So I started calling around and figuring out where that story came from. And sure enough, got it verified from the guy who ran the shrine of John Paul II in Poland. And when we talked to him about it, he's like, JPII said that? He's like, no, JPII told me that story happened. It happened to him. And what it was is there was a night in the early 1980s where JPII was asleep in the papal apartments, and he woke up and he kind of heard some noise. And so he got up and made sure the Holy Father was okay. Looks in the Pope's room, and the Pope's not there. So he's probably in the chapel. Walks down the hallway to the Pope's private chapel, and there's John Paul, as he would often do, pray marathons of prayer in the middle of the night. But he said John Paul's kneeling before the Blessed Sacrament, just groaning in prayer, as he often would. But he was speaking in Polish to the tabernacle, saying, Dlaczego, 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 which means why. Why now? I don't understand. Why now? So John Paul's having a conversation with the Blessed Sacrament. So Monsignor JPII kind of leaves him alone, goes back to his room. In the morning, everybody gets up, and Monsignor JPII said that John Paul normally is very interactive with guests and has a great sense of humor, is asking people questions, but this next morning, he wasn't himself. He wasn't very conversational. He didn't even eat breakfast. He refused to. He just had a little Italian tea. He was very recollected on something, and then later he went out for that day's Wednesday audience, and he was shot. It was the assassination attempt that day in St. Peter's Square. This was the Wednesday audience. He was supposed to launch the Pontifical Council for the Family. and the International Institute for Studies on the Marriage and the Family. These were to be the two teaching arms of the theology of the body of the modern world, and that was the audience they were supposed to be started. And he was shot on his way up to do these things during the 5 o'clock hour of the 13th day of May, which is the same month and day and hour that Our Lady of Fatima appeared to the visionaries years and years ago. And so John Paul saw that it was through her intercession that he was protected, because one bullet, went through his finger, passed through his abdomen, out the back of his tailbone, and came to rest in the Pope Mobile. Another bullet went through his forearm and into the neck of an American pilgrim who was there, and another woman got shot as well. And so 3 people were injured the day of the assassination. And so John Paul tapped a young priest in Rome who's from America also. Hey, can you follow up with those women, make sure they're okay, visit them in the hospital, and why don't you fly them out to Rome every year with me on the anniversary at that time so we can have mass together? And he tapped a young priest named Father Olmsted, who became the great Bishop Olmsted of Arizona, to keep in touch with these women. A year after that, he went over to Fatima to kind of give thanks to Our Lady, took the bullet that had pierced him and put it in the crown as a jewel of Our Lady of Fatima. But before that happened, he was doing a candlelight procession, walking around, and a priest stabbed him in Fatima a year after the assassination attempt. And John Paul pulled away, and the security detail tackled the guy to the ground. And the headline said, man attempts to attack John Paul II. But when he got back to the sacristy, he took off his vestments, and there's blood coming down, and they didn't realize that he had been stabbed. And he didn't want this to become public because he knew then security would push people away from him. And I think he still wanted to stay close to his flock. So, but it was fascinating. The day before all that happened, the year before, he was visiting the Vatican hospitals. They wanted him to come bless the new facilities, and they said, we have a new ambulance. Would you bless the ambulance? So he gets out the holy water and blesses the ambulance, and he said, I also bless the first person that will need that ambulance. Him 24 hours later.
Wow. I was just in Rome, and I saw that little paver they have in St. Peter's Square where it says, this is the spot he was shot. So he got shot twice.
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
3 or 4 bullets were fired. 2 went through him. Lost enough blood. They were almost certain he was going to die. But thankfully, the surgery room had already been prepared for an Italian soccer player who was going to be having surgery in that room. So everything was ready for surgery. And then when this happened, everything was prepared for him already.
What happened to the soccer player?
He had to postpone his ACL surgery or something. Something a little more important's coming. So
wow.
Yeah.
I know people make a big deal of how the assassin should have hit his mark but didn't. But I don't know. I mean, he shot him twice. It seems pretty good. Is it really so hard to believe that he wouldn't have killed him? I'm actually asking. I'm not sure.
Well, Mehmet Ali Agca was a professional assassin. He had just escaped from a prison in Turkey after assassinating, I believe, a journalist out there. And so he knew how to not miss his mark. I mean, standing point blank range from an elderly man with a 9mm handgun, firing several shots should get the job done. But the bullets, possibly because how they ricocheted off of the finger might have changed the trajectory of the bullet, and it missed his aorta, all his vital organs. And so, I mean, when the surgeon opened up his abdomen, there was so much blood in there, he was pretty much sure John Paul was lost. And so John Paul in the ambulance, you could hear him, Maria Madonna, Maria Madonna. He was just continuing to pray until he got to the hospital, and he was unconscious by the time he got there. But, recovered. And the first thing he asked Monsignor was, is it time for afternoon prayer? He was wondering if he didn't realize he'd been unconscious and in surgery, and he wanted to make sure he'd stay on track with Liturgy of the Hours. And but he said, he believed that blood needed to be spilled in St. Peter's Square for this message to be fruitful. And he was bishop. He wrote a poem. He said, if the word did not convert you, the blood will. And so what a gift to have him. I mean, imagine if that bullet had killed him. The Catechism, the new Code of Canon Law, World Youth Days, none of that would have come to pass. Right. But he had I
may not be converted at this point.
Yeah. I mean, that World Youth Day for you in the year 2000, he wouldn't have been there. Who would have been. But he had this boundless confidence in Our Lady that she would either shield him from suffering or help him to have the grace to endure it.
Hey, thank you so much for watching. Before you go, do us a favor, leave a comment, let us know what you thought of the video, like, and subscribe.